Good afternoon. I hope you are enjoying our virtual AAEA conference that has started today and will carry on through tomorrow. I've seen some wonderful sessions so far. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Don Thilmany McFadden as our president for the association 2020-21. She's a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University since 1997 with a BS in Public Service and Administration from ISU and an MS and PhD in Agricultural Economics from Cal Davis. She has over 90 peer-reviewed publications and presentations to over 400 academic, industry, and policy audiences. She's the co-director for CSU's Regional Economic Development Institute. She chaired the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council and co-leads the CSU Food Systems team. She collaborates with several USDA agencies, including ERS, AMS, and NIFA. She has served on the board, chaired the Selected Paper Committee, is currently on the AJE, has been on the AJE editorial board, has served as a representative to USDA NARI board on research, extension, education, and economics. Dawn has done so many great things to the profession, and it has been my pleasure to work with her for the past year on our executive board. I welcome Dawn's presentation today, her presidential address entitled Rebalancing Our Portfolio, Envisioning a More Inclusive, Altruistic, and Engaged AAEA. Please welcome my friend Dawn Thilmany.
Thank you, Keith. That was a very nice introduction, and as you can all imagine that know me, I'm honored to have this chance to get to talk a little bit about my perspective and vision for the association today. As I was thinking about how I wanted to frame my conversation today, of course, it was challenging to put it all into one theme, but I came up with rebalancing our portfolio because I really see some of the key criteria I used in developing my own professional plan and things that the association contributed to me and that I feel like I can contribute to the association. And the whole idea of rebalancing means that there's some tipping point we've reached. And so that's how I want to start my conversation today. I feel like we really are at a tipping point, both as a society and as an association. And so I revisited some reading I did over a decade ago by Malcolm Gladwell, and was reminded of some of the three key points he says about when we feel like there's something going on that might mean we're going to see a societal shift. And was very fortunate that this morning in the plenary session, this same concept was already brought up. So I think we're onto something. The first concept he lays out is the law of the few, or sometimes we call that the 80-20 concept, where 20% of the people do the work, or in this case, provide the vision forward for an organization in a time of change. So he goes on to name those as the connectors, the mavens, and the salesmen. And throughout the presentation today, I'll bring up some of the examples I feel like we've had in our association. He also talks about the power of context, and the quote that rung true to me, of course, was epidemics are sensitive to the conditions and circumstances of the times and places in which they occur. Well, given the last few months, I think we can all say we're in unprecedented times, both for our food system, agriculture, natural resources, and our professions. So that we meet that criteria. There's also the stickiness factor, that the message we have and the changes we want to make are worth spreading so they're not doomed to failure. And that's where the engaged part of my talk comes in. How are we making sure what we do is relevant and impactful? And finally, this is kind of a sub point he makes, but important to some of the discussion I want to have today about how he really sees that there's only a maximum number of members that can reasonably contribute within a tribe or a network. And so that reaches a maximum at about 150. And given the size of our association, we're far bigger. So where do we look for places where those smaller groups can make impacts and be included in our mission? So with that, let's look at how I see this relating to AAEA's pathway over the next couple of months or years. First of all, I've had to retrain my own self. I've always talked in terms of diversity, and as you can see from the quote on the left-hand side, Diversity is a state of being, whereas really what we're looking for here is a style of interaction or inclusiveness that our association can look to make sure everybody feels like they have a place at the table. So I want to go over today a little bit about what I see as the mavens and connectors of our past that have really led to some of the changes that have already helped us make progress as an association. Then look at our current portfolio and look at for that value that the covariances of people and groups and issues and topics and diversity can bring into strengthening a portfolio's potential returns and value. And then finally, we know one thing we always want to measure is if that rebalancing we did has made a difference. So we have to measure to manage. And the three things I think we really want to pay attention to moving forward are the climate, our members and our stakeholders' view from us, the connectedness they feel to us, and the engagement we bring to bear. So let's look at a little timeline. I wish I had better graphic design capabilities, but this is what I could come up with. And we are a little over 100 years old. For the very longest time, we were called the American Agricultural Economics Association. And I still, sometimes when I make a mistake, slip back into that. Although a little over 20 years ago, we did rename ourselves. And that's one of the first places I can note that we try to make a more inclusive umbrella for people to sit under, is thinking about really the broader set of issues our association looks at. But this is a timeline I made specifically about the diversity and inclusion. One part of diversity and inclusion I want to talk about, which is who we see at the table. And most of this change has happened during the time I've been a part of the association, which started in 1991. And although I try to highlight here lots of milestones and some of the people responsible for those who were the original mavens and connectors, a few I want to highlight because they were important to me are Dr. Sylvia Lane, who was that first connector who came to me at one of my early meetings and made sure I knew someone who had great esteem, cared that I was there, and wondered what I was wanting to do with my profession, and made a huge difference. So not surprisingly, when they decided to name a fellowship in her honor, I welcomed the invitation from Jean Kinsey and Maureen Kilkenny to do that. And it's been a great success story of how we can mentor our people and make a difference. Second thing I wanted to point out here is the many leaders who've been the first in directions, and some of them will be highlighted in my comments later. But a group that brought me under their wing, again, pre us even having sections, there was a community economics network, now called CRENET, who was commonly gathering, not in meeting rooms, but at the bar after sessions, and making sure all of us who worked on regional economics had a place to touch base with each other at those very big meetings. And in fact, when they had the idea to establish sections under the big tent we now call AAEA, they went to that group and looked for best practices, because they, along with Seaway and Cosbay, were really kind of the first committees or networks that were trying to give people smaller networks and nodes to connect with within the association. And so the sections really emanated from that community economics network long ago, and I'm proud to still be very connected to them. So thanks for all of those mavens and connectors who've made a difference so far, making our organization more connected. And then the last group that we'll talk about and hear more about later is when we started measuring that employment tracking survey, which we did many, many years ago and have refocused on again under the leadership of Cosbay and Seaway. So what has our progress been since 1996 when we first started measuring? Unfortunately, we mostly have done this in the academic realm, but we certainly could imagine how to look at these same data for our government, industry, and organizational professionals. We do see there has been some increase in diversity. And so looking at the bright side of these numbers, we see the wedges that represent both white females in the profession and underrepresented minorities have grown across all ranks. Unfortunately, we can't break out the underrepresented minorities because in the first survey, they did not break that down by gender, unfortunately. Although that's really good news, what we see is it's still not fully representative of our even membership right now. Although, again, these are supply chains, so they take a while for that to play out. But we would still imagine from the numbers we see here that between the assistant and full level, we are seeing some attrition, and that still does cause us some concern, and we'll explore that a little bit later. But I also challenge us to think about diversity and inclusion a little more broadly than just gender and equity. It's a myriad of lifestyle choices, including where we decide we want to make our professional contributions, what topics we want to work on, whether we're more impassioned by what we can do in the classroom than what we can do in the research field, than what we can do in the engagement field versus what we can do in the policy field. And so really we're gonna think about this more broadly about how we encourage there to be more inclusiveness by looking at the different ways people are trying to be impactful in the world through the public goods of the research and education we do, and how that might be strengthened through better engagement. So this is from our peers in the general economics field, and again, speaks to some of the concerns we continue to have. So in a survey they did just last year, and I attributed the authors down below, they actually talked to the survey we just saw that I hope you saw, we attributed to the Seaway and Cosbay leaders that have been leading that. They talked to department heads first, and we'll talk about their survey of members here in a little bit, but the AAEA went straight to the members and try to engage with them and got 10,000 of them to respond. And what you see here is they couch things in terms of costly avoidance activities. So this is where you're seeing a barrier to your professional goals and aspirations because of some concern about tension, bullying, unwelcomeness. And we can see across the board, there's actually still some concerns there, regardless of gender or race, but it's particularly acute among people of color and women. And when you're looking at some of the things they're measuring here, and that it's keeping people from going to conferences, voicing their views, or even leaving a job, we can see there's still work to do. And so for some reason, people are not feeling a place at a table in all cases. So I want to frame this a little bit in the context of altruism. And the reason I chose that is because in my early work in food systems, when you talked about why you saw alternative systems shaping up, it was because people didn't feel there was a place for them in the markets or in their current food system. And so I quickly started reading some of the literature on altruism and where people were trying to make a difference with either their choices as a producer, their choices as a consumer. But it turns out there's a lot to learn from that literature about how we see a whole variety of social structures play out. So one of the articles I found most compelling that was written by a sociologist actually, but in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, framed things in a very interesting way that I think can help move the discussion along. One is this idea of social norms and network density, and that we actually see more altruism, more public good provision, and more trust built, not surprisingly, in dense networks where we know people, they're familiar to us, and they're working on the same things as us. So it really reinforces good behavior, and that's a great thing. But we could imagine it actually has the unintended implication of leading to bad behavior too, because when we get comfortable there, sometimes we may unintentionally do a lockdown where new ideas can't flow in. And in fact, that leads to a second point of this idea of the strength of weak ties, where unlike where we can benefit in those dense networks from having that trust, where we really see in the scientific field a lot of new information, ideas, and innovation happen, is where people have weak ties that bridge outside of their network to groups that don't exactly hold their social norms, but where there's some kind of bridge already made, and that's where those connectors really come in. And in fact, they go so far in the next point to talk about it as thinking of it as structural holes, where actually those connectors and those mavens who are the visionaries see where there could be a bridge. Those connectors go about the hard work of building those bridges and tying those multiple networks together where there's some value to be gained from the innovation that can happen across that. And it's starting to sound a lot like interdisciplinary work to a lot of you, and we'll come back to that because that's in fact what it is. But really, this is a way that the sociologists think about it as social embeddedness, that some of the economic activity we see happen doesn't happen because of necessarily economic levers, but because of the non-economic structures we put into place where trust and connections and networks can easily flow. So two quotes that really resonated with me in this context are one from Mackenzie Scott, who is the ex-wife of Bezos, and this was a quote she made when she was making her commitment to the Giving Pledge, of that there's no question in my mind that anyone's personal wealth is the product of a collective effort and of social structures which present opportunities to some people, but unfortunately obstacles to countless others. And even though this is about wealth, we could say the same thing about connectedness within our organization. Who are the people who are already in the in crowd, and what benefits do they get that we need to make more fully available to the full crowd? Or if you want to boil it down to one of my childhood heroes, Mr. Rogers, for those of you who are doing that connecting, I hope you're proud of yourself for the times you've said yes when all it really meant was going to be extra work for you and was seemingly helpful only to somebody else, because you're the people who have allowed some of these social structures to be reimagined and rethought. So another way to think about altruism and pro-social behavior is in the context of corporate social responsibility, which allows me to return back to that portfolio concept. Again, thinking of how this has played out in markets. You know, we had consumers out there following this quote of every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. So in the early 80s, 90s, we had people voting with their dollars, and it used to be quite admirable or heroic for a company to say it was giving 1% of its profits to the planet, or Ben & Jerry were committing their profits to Vermont dairy farmers. But we also see that as there were returns and rewards for that, it becomes something more and more corporations look at. And so to the right-hand side, we get to a point where it becomes so common for people to make a commitment to sustainability that now it's not necessarily an extra return or reward you get, but there's actually a stigma if you don't go along with that same new social norm. What's the real weird tipping point there in that middle, and that matter is where you're in that uncomfortable space where it hasn't quite become the social norm yet, but you're not reaping that many benefits from doing the heroic right thing. And again, we may be at that exact place right now with what we need to do with diversity inclusion. Where's the hard work to be done to make it a new set of social norms that some of the things we now point out as examples or one-offs become the norm we all abide by. So we draw this from literature where we've even looked at how this has played out in markets and with policy. So let's look back a little bit at some of our past leaders and mavens who've actually made some of these visions and connections that have allowed us to move forward. The first is both Ralph Christie and Gene Kinsey felt one of the real tasks we had as an organization, and the reason we're probably renamed, was to have deeper and broader connections across applied economics and move from some of what some people considered more narrow topics that we were focused on pre-1970s and 80s to the broad set of challenges we have to connect with food systems and natural resource systems and public health and energy. And so they were really the mavens asking us to be more inclusive in the context of the issues that we work on and that we teach in the classroom. And those are important things for us to actually start making the steps towards having a place at the table for everybody who wants to make an impact in applied economics. Next of all, we were challenged by Sandra Beatty to tackle wicked problems where we might have to look at that hard work that there is to be done to handle more complex issues such as sustainability we heard about this morning, and that might come at the cost of feeling less productive if you're a researcher, or a few more hours to prepare your curriculum if you're a teacher, or a few more community discussions to have if you're an extension agent. That's hard work, but it is part of actually being relevant and engaged. Caswell put it in a different way as we've seen our departments morph into departments that actually include some of the names of the broader topics that we want to teach and engage our communities on, that it challenges us to continue to make connections with other fields. And then of course, Ron Middlehammer and his call for us to look at ourselves as a big tent asked us to encourage the use of a greater variety of alternative methods so that we don't lose that rich diversity that different members of our association and our field can bring to the table. And finally, this even comes to some of how we'll approach doing our methods. First, in Susan Offit's talk when she was giving her presidential address, she asked us to take a renewed look at where we are with farm policy analysis, and particularly about the outcomes we kept talking about stewarding the land and the well-being of rural areas, and make sure the data we were collecting were allowing us to actually measure whether we were making progress on those. So it really ended up being a challenge to think about if our data is going to allow us to do the analysis of some of the outcomes that under that broad umbrella of applied economics we were promising our farm and food system could give to us. And then Jason, from more of a consumer perspective, also gave us the challenge again of where data lies in this, and are we actually measuring the right things to make sure that the consumers and the different things they wanted to capture from the food system were something we could actually analyze in a meaningful way. So again, they kind of set the stage for how this might impact somewhat our research, but I use data and concepts like this just as relevantly with my outreach work as well. And so finally, just last year, Keith Coble put this in the context of elegance versus relevance. And I would go so far as even to push relevance into talking about how transdisciplinary we are. And so he actually presented some really nice data about where our keystone journals were connecting to other fields of study. Again, kind of that challenge Ralph Christie and Gene Kinsey put out long ago about how relevant our research is to other bodies of literature and vice versa. And so he really set up the discussion well for that version of inclusiveness. So that leads you to the question of, does an engaged, socially minded teaching and research agenda really encourage a more inclusive culture? Because if that's kind of one of the things we want from our portfolio, we should think about that. And I found another great quote I really liked, that, you know, the economics we practice today with the insights from psychology and sociology, probably more on the consumer side, but even for those of you working in natural resources, that draws more and more from what we've learned from the biological and ecological sciences, it may be less disciplined than it was in the past. So it's messier, it's less model-centric, it can't even be as theory-driven as we are used to, but there's no doubt it's probably got the trade-off of, with that diminished rigor, it's come with the benefit of a greater realism, relevancy, and increased likelihood. And so I really liked that quote, even though I kind of paraphrased it there. And it's really resonated in my own professional life. I've always been at the table with multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams, dreaming up curriculum, looking at extension programs, coming up with the next research project. But in a project I'm on, led by Dr. Becca Jablonski, that's funded by the New FAR initiative, I've really been introduced to transdisciplinary, where we're really talking about not plugging and playing, not bringing our research method or our toolbox or our problem statement to the project, but literally authentically sitting down with those teams and rebuilding something that doesn't look quite like anything we've ever seen before. And as you can see from a typical graphic below, it is messy. It doesn't allow us to use even close to the rigor of our best methods, but it's allowing us to authentically integrate. And increasingly, that also has those stakeholders at the table, whether they be students or industry people or government people or nonprofits or all of the above, and challenge us to make sure we can make them understand what we're trying to learn from our projects. So again, thinking of how we've approached this idea in a few ways from across our association, our AAEA editors and leaders took the 100th anniversary of that Keystone publication to look at what's even happened in our own journals. And so you can see they kind of did some tracking of authors, collaborations across authors, and something they introduced me to, which is this harmonic closeness of the tightness within authorships and then the distance across those nodes. And you can see 4 decades they mapped out fairly cleverly here on the right-hand side that are in this article. You can go look at more. And what you can see is there's some social geometry going on here. We see clusters both getting a little more dense within each other, but still staying somewhat connected to each other. And this is our actual authorships within those journals. And now there's even websites you can go to and do this for yourself, and it's called Connected Papers, and you can see how your papers connect to the literature. It allows you to start thinking about really your contributions, not just in how you're getting citations, but how you're connecting to other parts of our field and our applied economics and the broader set of social sciences and the broader set of ag and food and natural resource sciences. So let me bring this back to my final concept I wanted to focus on, which is engagement, which is this idea of how do we make sure the teaching, research, and outreach we do is as engaged with the communities and stakeholders as possible, and that those communities and stakeholders are as diverse and inclusive as the people we should be benefiting with the public good of our work. And so again, those of us in extension and outreach have seen models of this before, but I have to be honest, when I started 25 years ago or so ago, the first 3 columns on the left-hand side were what I was doing. I was going out, translating research, talking with people, sometimes being included on teams. But what I really see happening in the land-grant universities and probably with government as there's an increased call for accountability, and definitely within industries as we're continuing to see them engage all the partners who make their markets work or not, is the fact that we have to go a little farther and make that engagement be at the level of collaboration or even empowerment, where some of what we're doing is truly bi-directional. And so I really want to lean into some of the people of expertise in that among our membership, including an extension, to talk about if we're really leveraging the true value of integrated research, teaching, and extension across our membership and the partnerships and stakeholders we work with outside of our field. And what can we as actually an association internally learn from this level of this model of engagement, and where we should be empowering our members to give us a little more feedback that we can use to actually find our way forward. And we'll return to that when we talk about sections a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about a survey that I did find that was done last year about public engagement. An increasing number of public universities have been taking on engagement as a keystone mission of their work. And so they did a survey and got fairly good responses across the faculty at 46 land grants. And what you found is that the majority of people did feel public engagement was a very important part of their job. Younger faculty were more likely to be engaged, as were social scientists, because this is our peers across the entire university, not just ag economists. But what's interesting to note from this graphic also is those faculty fully agree that people far above them in their universities value public engagement, but the closer they got back to their supervisors or departments, they were not quite so certain how well it would be valued. And that's a very clear signal we need to be giving to our young scholars and government workers and industry people, is how important public engagement is going to be. And so part of it is understanding what the motivations for that are. And here we see that the top two ranked things are people just want to make sure the public is better informed about the science they study and that they trust it. And particularly in this day and age and what's been happening over the last few months with the lack of trust in science, I think if we did this survey again today, it would even be more acute, this interest. And again, we're finding that those younger scholars out there are even more impassioned about just getting people excited about the science they study, and that a social scientist among the sample were interested in that bidirectional learning, which you see in the fourth point about you also want to extract some information about what the public thinks about the science that we're working on. So these are important things for engagement. So let me tell you about what I feel like engagement looks like within our association. I'm excited to say that even as of May, we were above 3,000 members this year. The leadership and board were excited to see that level of engagement in a year we knew was going to be atypical and we likely would not be able to meet in person. So thank you for being a member of our organization. More importantly, in that very large tent, we have 25 active sections ranging from 25 members to 319 members. And you can see from the right-hand side table that inclusive nature is there. We have them divided by, some of them are based on what people want to study. Some of them are based on what functions people want to focus on, teaching and learning versus extension versus econometrics. Some of it is focused on what part of the world you want to study. Some of it is based on you wanting to have a place where you connect with people of your gender or ethnic identity. So we have a rich set of sections, and not surprisingly, you see we're operating around those numbers of what Gladwell told us we need as those smaller nodes and networks to feel like we have an identity within an organization. So it's encouraging to see that grand experiment of using sections as a way to give people a home base in AAEA perhaps has worked. And in fact, the numbers show over 60% of our members choose to be a part of a section, at least one. I thought I was a heavy user by being a member of 5 of them, but in fact, there's over 360 of us that actually belong to that many, and almost 100 that belong to up to 10 sections. So there's not just engagement with these, there's apparently, it's become a cottage industry of our organization. But back to a serious note, I wanted to know, has that helped our members stay more engaged? Well, in an average year, I had 2019 to look at, we had about 50% of our membership who are dues paying also come to an annual meeting. But that number went up to 57% if the member belonged to a section, and up to 63% if the member belonged to 5 or more sections. So perhaps it is easier for a member to stay engaged and feel like there is a reason to go to the meetings and stay active in the organization if they feel like within that big, broad network that they want weak linkages across the entire 3,000 set of members. They still have that group of 25 to 319 people that are more closely connected to the norms of how they want to lead their professional life. So I felt that was encouraging. Yet, there's not all good news. Again, hot off the presses from that great group of Seaway and Causeway leaders who have put together 2 surveys in the last year. And you can go see a whole session on this, August 28th at 11 a.m. Because I only am giving you one slide from that, and there's a lot to learn. They showed that regardless of gender, regardless of stage of career, regardless of ethnicity, there is still a large set of our membership who is not finding that they can strongly agree with the fact that they have a community they belong to within our association. And albeit this is only 432 of our members, and I just showed you we have 3,000. And it also actually surveyed some past members because we wanted to know why they might have left. It's still a signal to us that there's work to be done. And so one quote I pulled from our grandfather of economics, Adam Smith, is, "What improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconvenience to the whole." So if we want to flourish and be happy and healthy as an organization, we need to worry about the set of people who aren't saying they can strongly agree. They know there's a place for them in this association. And so I offer up that as a challenge we continue to work on. So we've just as a board spent a lot of time in the last 6 months talking about what our response is going to be. And you'll be seeing some highlights of that in some columns that will be coming up this fall. But it's not quite refined enough that I feel ready to share, but it is a new part of our strategic plan. But what I wanted to look at as an example of where we might follow is what the AAEA has put together for best practices to address at least some of the issues that we've talked about today might be the challenges for our association. And although there's a far bigger list than what I present here on the screen, I did want to highlight these 2, particularly because mentorship is a place, even before recent events, that we have decided to reinvest a lot of energy as an organization, and been led by Madhu Khanna and will now be led by Dr. Kathleen Lang. But that's a place we're also going to be looking for if we're mentoring in a diverse enough way and in an inclusive enough way that everybody sees a place that they can see a pathway forward for the professional they want to be. And the other one I wanted to highlight, because Jill McCluskey is another past presidential address who challenged us to diversify or die. And one of her challenges was that we need to create a place where people can make very different work-life choices and still see a place they can have a professional pathway that's rewarding for them. And I think that's something we need to all look at as well, and was a challenge she gave us a couple years ago. So perhaps we developed this exact same best practices for our organization, but customized a bit to better fit the culture of our membership. So with that, I've covered a lot of grounds, but I do want you to know that I think all of these conversations are ones that are just starting points, and that I unfortunately don't come today with as many answers as I have ideas of how we move forward. But one last challenge I guess I can give you is your opportunity to invest. So I used to use the quote, draw a circle around what you can impact and make good there. Well, I found actually, I think, a better quote, which is draw a circle around yourself, but know that you're inviting people in or keeping them out. And in that way, you're kind of a creator of your own social geometry. And now that I've talked a little bit about some of these connections and weak links and places that you can be connecting for the greater good, I want you to at least think about how you might recreate your social geometry, because that geometry is going to have a direct effect on the volume of impact you can have as a professional. So one stat I always like that's thrown out there is that you have about 80,000 hours in your career. Some of us are well into that 80,000, unfortunately, but some of you are just the start of it. So I challenge you to think about how you're going to spend the 80,000 hours. How are you going to engage with your local and global challenges, whether they're in the classroom or they're in your county or they're in your state or they're in a region of the world? How are you going to refine your social geometry so that your professional portfolio is having the impact that you want it to have and the outcomes you expect to reap from it? So that's your personal challenge. Professionally, I challenge you to think about how you become just a little bit more of a connector than perhaps you are already. Attend one of the sessions that we're doing here virtually with presenters and authors you don't know yet, that aren't part of that tight network you're comfortable with. Connect with them, offer them feedback, get to know somebody new. And even though that seems harder virtually because you can't give them that handshake, in a way it's easier because you're not as rushed and you have time to look over the sessions and offer some really nice insights to either the posters or the papers and presentations. And then finally, if you believe in some of the mission I've laid out that we still have yet to refine about investing in our diversity efforts, inclusivity efforts, our mentoring efforts, and our young professionals to make sure an increasingly high share of them feel they can agree they have a place at the table, go and donate to the trust. We made these meetings free of charge because we knew they were compromised. But if you find it in your heart, whether it's $5 or $100 or $1,000, go donate and make it possible for us to take on some huge challenges over the next couple of years. And we will make sure they're spent in the way you designate with that gift. So I have to end, of course, with acknowledging the fact that so many of the things that I've tried to share today were inspired by conversations I've had with clever people and the connectors I've had in my life and the networks and the mentors. My own department here at Colorado State University just could not be a better work family. I've gotten to be a leader in several organizations that have become part of my family. I have students who challenge me to continue to think strongly. But the people I really want to point out in this are two mentors I did say goodbye to this year. Wally Huffman taught me one of my first classes at Iowa State. He was in my first regional research committee on immigration, and his family became friends because our daughters came to conferences together, and it was a hard goodbye. Pulling it together. And my own department head, Lee Gray, that hired me, passed away in the last couple weeks. And he was the person who allowed me to have the work-life balance I chose to have. And it was important to me. Sorry. And last of all, my daughter, Elizabeth. A real hero, and you guys have been so warm and welcoming her to be the applied economist she now wants to be. And I only wish every young person had the warm welcoming she has had from you all, and so thank you for that. I'm gonna stop now before I lose it because I have to answer questions. But the last thank you, of course, is to my partner and husband, Matt McFadden, who allows me to invest so much in the organization by sharing me well with my profession, and I appreciate him too. So with that, I've pulled myself back together, and I'm happy to answer any questions or take any feedback. Oh, I see it now. Okay, thank you very much, Keith. Great, so what are some of my short-term goals for the year? Well, I don't think my goals are as important as the organization's goals. And I think I almost made a slide on this, and I could pull that up if you want, but I think the board has spent the majority of its actually board meeting this year talking about exactly how we pursue some of these goals. And one is definitely not just to continue to invest in mentorship, but rethink both the type and levels of mentorship we do. You know, partly because because again, we get caught in our network. A lot of our mentoring has been under the assumption people are all going to be at academic universities, following a tenure track, worried about research. And we know from our membership numbers that the professional pathways people want to follow are far more diverse than that. So one way to be more inclusive is to make our mentoring activities mimic that. And there was already great plans for that under Madhu, and I think Dr. Lang's taking them on. But also we realized some of this diversity issue is quite honestly a pipeline issue. And I think the reason we've seen some of the issues around gender resolve a little more closely than people of color is because if you look at the supply chains in our agribusiness, ag econ, food systems, natural resource programs, The undergraduate population is closer to 50-50, but we're not seeing that in the case of people of color. So we need to go back to probably even earlier in the supply chain of education and engage people. Some people think that might be going back and using the great network of Manners and a new organization we found, Together We Grow, to find students at the undergraduate level. It may even be using our extension colleagues to think about how we go back as far as the 4-H and FFA level and really make sure people are aware of the interesting careers they can have in agriculture, including our own social science ones. So I'd say a lot of what I'm thinking about is around the mentoring area, but we also have our publications committee thinking hard about how they both can evaluate the portfolio of publications we have, but also the review process and how we welcome different topics into our publications. And we've already seen their impact go up because of some thoughtful considerations in the past. So I have no doubt they'll think of other clever things as well. I'm not going to remember everything we decided on, but I think we also will probably be revisiting our awards, calls for awards, thinking about if we have a diverse enough set of awards, if the criteria we're using to give people awards is important. And then last of all, using some of the results from that climate survey. I would keep your eyes out. I think this fall we'll probably have a set of listening sessions that might involve us thinking about what we learned from those climate surveys and thinking about how we might take action. So unfortunately, I probably have more goals than I have the energy to do them, but I have to thank everybody, to almost a person. Everyone I asked to serve on a committee this year has said yes to me, and I have some amazing people joining those. So we just may be calling a larger set of our leadership to action as well. So sorry for that long answer, but I have some goals. I just hope all of you help me realize them. Is there another question? I really wish I was looking at all of you out over an audience, although I probably would have been more nervous, but it'd be much easier to take cues about if there's people who wanted to chat. Are there any other questions, Keith?
Not right now. Let me pose one to you, Dawn. Sure. You talked a little bit about our move to sections, and you and I have been around long enough to know that there was a time when that was somewhat controversial. How essential are sections to the future of the association and the addition of new sections if needed?
It's a good question. I think you and I were both around when they were being posited as an idea. I wasn't sure I was a believer then either. But again, when I reflected on it, and they did come to the Community Economics Network, and I thought about the fact that that group had made a huge difference for me, feeling like I had a place to connect. I guess it was pretty hard to debate that having that for a larger share of people was a good idea. And again, the numbers ring pretty true, because for the most part, I think CRENET might be the only free section, but for most of those, that's a pay to play. It's not people just saying they want to be involved. They're paying to be involved. And if you look at some of the leadership and the fact that those leaders have helped us make this virtual conference a reality, because we had to lean into our sections to provide some of the structure we couldn't put under this umbrella of this virtual platform we're on. I think it just reinforced how important it is to have well-functioning sections. Now, we're going to have the trade-offs. I think there are people who feel like there still could be more diversity there because they don't quite see ones that fit their interest. But at the same time, we know there's transaction costs and administrative and leadership work that needs to be done every time we add one as well. And we need to make sure that that trade-off works out right. But I guess I would say that given the ones I've interacted with that I've seen step up over the last 3 months to help this program go on, I still think they're, in my opinion, one of the best signals of engagement by our membership. And going back to even those people who are willing to do that hard work of making those weak links stay there, so we can have innovation across our organization and still be 3,000 strong, but have small tribes within that big tent doing great things that are more connected to the direct outcomes they want from their professional life. I think they're paramount. And I guess the only thing I would say is that we may need to think about restructuring them, because, for instance, we have ones like Seaway and Causeway that really started off as committees. They were there before the sections, and sometimes if we get a little compartmentalized like that, we'll say things like, well, Seaway's covering that because it's a gender issue, or Cosbay's handling that because it's a diversity and inclusion issue, whereas really every single section should be taking on those challenges. But that's why I'm also heartened almost every year to see in the program how much cross linkages happen across our sections, and the fact that people are always looking for opportunities to find ways to partner with each other as well. So I'm sure it all is a little more hairy than that when it gets down to the details, but I do think they're a really important part of our pathway forward in figuring out how to give everybody a place at the table under this big tent of AAEA. Otherwise, thank you for your time. I am going to be walking around some of the network receptions the next couple of days. If you want to grab my ear and tell me something I was off point about, or where you wanted to know a little bit more about what I was thinking, I'm happy to. But I sure appreciate the time to address the group, and I maybe left a little too much time for questions and answers, given that it's kind of quiet. But I know it's a weird platform to ask those into.
Dawn, thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.